The high-altitude wind wasn't just a sound, it was a blunt, physical force, actively trying to tear the heavy canvas of the base camp command tent completely off its reinforced aluminum frame. The fabric snapped and cracked like a bullwhip, threatening to buckle the eastern support poles with every violent gust. I stood near the heavy industrial propane heater, using a brass wrench to adjust the regulator valve. The main fuel line was freezing in the extreme altitude, the gas flow stuttering dangerously. I tightened the brass fitting, applying precise torque until the hiss of the propane smoothed out into a steady, reliable roar. I set the heavy wrench down and placed my gloved hands flat on the edges of a topographical map spread across the folding metal table, pinning the paper against the freezing drafts slipping under the tent skirts. The air inside the tent smelled of bitter, overboiled coffee, damp wool base layers, and the sharp, distinct tang of ozone from the massive radio console stacked in the corner. The digital temperature gauge, bolted to the central pole, read -10 degrees Fahrenheit, and the red numbers were actively dropping. We were positioned at exactly 12,000 feet on the primary southern approach to the summit. I traced the tightly packed elevation lines with the tip of a heavy black marker, calculating the kerosene fuel burn rate for the next 24 hours. My expedition agency was running on a razor-thin profit margin this season. Securing the exclusive municipal guiding contract for this specific peak was the only thing keeping my company out of bankruptcy. I viewed the mountain as a massive, frozen spreadsheet, an asset to be conquered, managed, and monetized. The heavy, overlapping flap of the tent whipped open violently, letting in a blinding, horizontal spray of white snow and a sudden, brutal drop in atmospheric pressure. A woman stepped inside, immediately hauling the stiff canvas shut behind her and securing the heavy brass toggle with practiced efficiency. She didn't pause to shake the accumulated snow from the shoulders of her bright red expedition parka. She walked directly to the map table, her breathing sharp, rhythmic, and visible in the freezing air. This was Camille Walker. 2 weeks ago, she had bypassed my receptionist entirely at my coastal training facility in California. A rival guide company had anonymously accused my agency of falsifying safety data, and Camille, a senior corporate risk analyst, was there to physically audit my operation. I put her in the industrial sub-zero training freezer that same afternoon to test her baseline. When she gripped the training ice axe like a delicate pen, I walked up, physically uncurled her fingers, and wrapped them securely around the forged shaft. "It's a hammer, Walker. You don't ask the ice for permission, you take the grip." She hadn't flinched, but simply adjusted her stance and drove the pick into the synthetic ice wall with absolute, methodical force. Now, standing on the actual ice at 12,000 feet, she pulled her heavy, polarized goggles down to rest around her neck. Her dark eyes were sharp in the dim, yellow light of the tent. "The secondary comms relay on the east face just went dark," Camille stated, her voice tight but entirely steady. She pointed a thick, insulated glove at the radio console, and the digital barometer on the main ridge is showing a massive, localized pressure drop. "We have a severe squall building directly over the upper pass." I looked up from the topographical map, my jaw setting into a hard line. A localized drop wasn't in the 48-hour forecast. The forecast was built on generalized historical models, she countered smoothly, tapping the glass of the barometer with her knuckle. "I build predictive risk models for a living, Zaire. The raw data on that screen says we have less than 3 hours before absolute whiteout conditions hit this exact elevation. The temperature delta is going to shatter the local models." I didn't argue with her assessment. Ignoring raw data was how ambitious guides died. I reached across the table and keyed the heavy, rubberized radio mic. "Marcus, this is Zaire. What is the operational status on the ridge relay?" Static hissed violently through the external speaker for 10 long, agonizing seconds before my base camp manager's voice broke through the interference. "Dead, boss. The wind shear tore the solar antenna array clean off the granite. But that's not the primary issue. Vance's commercial team just pushed past Camp 2. They're ignoring the pressure drop. They're trying to force a summit push before the weather hits. I released the mic button, the plastic clicking sharply. Vance was a rival outfitter. He was notoriously reckless, entirely focused on getting his high-paying, inexperienced clients to the top so he could cash their final checks, regardless of the active risk matrix. If Vance pushes his client team into a high-altitude squall, he's going to trigger a massive emergency protocol that pulls all municipal resources off this mountain, I said, my voice dropping into a low, flat, angry register, which means the Park Service automatically revokes all active summit permits for the sector. My agency loses the primary access contract for the entire winter season. Camille watched me carefully. And if your operational contract is revoked for a safety violation in your sector, the specific liability clause in my corporate insurance policy is permanently invalidated. My firm takes a massive financial hit, and my professional license gets suspended for approving you. We don't lose the contract, I stated. I walked to the corner of the tent and grabbed my heavy, forged steel ice axe, checking the edge of the adze with my thumb. My commercial permit includes an emergency municipal clause for imminent weather hazards. If I physically hang the laminated red closure tag on the primary upper ridge anchor and radio the ranger desk with the code, it becomes an official, legally binding mountain closure. Vance has to turn around immediately, or the rangers document the violation, and his permit is suspended immediately. I turned toward the heavy tent flap, my mind already calculating the quickest vertical ascent route through the rocky couloir. "I'm going with you," Camille said. I stopped dead. I turned back, looking at her rigid posture. "If you close the pass alone, Vance will immediately file a formal grievance, claiming you did it maliciously to monopolize the summit window," she stated, her voice carrying absolute, undeniable authority. "If I am standing right there as the lead corporate underwriter, actively verifying the hazard data in real time, his grievance is legally dead on arrival. You need my professional verification on the ice." I looked at the unyielding set of her shoulders. She was terrified of the extreme cold, but she was entirely unwilling to lose her 15-year career to a reckless rival outfitter. "If you choose to turn back now, I'll radio Marcus and escort you down to the lower staging area," I said, my tone entirely flat, presenting the absolute boundary and giving her the clear agency to refuse. "But if you choose to climb, you accept my pace and my safety rules. There is no turning back halfway." "I expect you to set the pace," she replied instantly, walking to the gear pile and picking up her own forged ice axe. I stepped up to her, invading her personal space to enforce protocol. I grabbed the heavy nylon webbing of her climbing harness, giving the primary loop a sharp, violent tug to test the double-backed buckles. She didn't flinch. I checked the locking mechanism on her carabiners, listening for the sharp, metallic snap of the gate closing. Everything was secure. We left the relative safety of the base camp 10 minutes later. The wind outside was a solid, physical wall, pushing aggressively against our chests with relentless force. I took the lead, my heavy steel crampons biting deep into the packed, blue ice of the trail. The world was rapidly reduced to the immediate 3 feet of visibility, illuminated by the stark white beam of my headlamp. I set a punishing, brutally aggressive pace. My ambition, the absolute burning need to secure my business contract and crush Vance's sabotage, drove my legs forward like pistons. I didn't look back. I listened for the rhythmic, metallic crunch of her crampons, syncing with mine. For the first grueling hour, the sound behind me was steady and consistent. We navigated a maze of towering ice seracs, massive blocks of frozen water the size of small buildings. The path narrowed to a tight vertical chimney. I scaled it rapidly, my tools finding solid purchase. I reached the top of the chute and established a quick belay. Camille followed. Halfway up the vertical ice, her mechanical ascender jammed on a frozen knot in the fixed line. She paused, her breathing ragged, using one hand to try and force the cam open. She was losing momentum, burning precious calories, fighting the gear instead of the mountain. "Stop fighting the friction," I barked down at her, my voice cutting through the wind. "Drop your weight onto your harness, unweight the line, then clear the cam." She immediately stopped fighting. She deliberately let her weight drop back into her harness, trusting the anchor I had built. The tension on the ascender released. She cleared the ice with her thumb, engaged the teeth, and powered her way up the rest of the chute. She didn't complain about my tone. She just executed the logic. The incline steepened sharply to 45 degrees as we approached the exposed, rocky spine of the upper ridge. The wind intensified into a scream, howling through the jagged granite formations and kicking up a blinding ground blizzard. We hit a narrow, exposed traverse where the wind threatened to peel us directly off the face of the mountain. A massive gust slammed into us. Camille stumbled, her boot sliding on a patch of black ice. I immediately dropped to one knee, driving the shaft of my ice axe deep into the snowpack to establish a self-arrest position. My arm locked and rigid. The rope between us pulled taut, catching her weight safely before she could slide toward the edge. She didn't panic. She dug her front crampon points into the wall, stabilized her center of gravity, and kept moving. We hit a section of rotten, sun-cupped ice, spanning a 5-foot gap over a steep drop. I stopped. The old fixed line spanning the gap was frayed, the nylon sheath torn by the wind. I didn't trust it. I pulled a 22-centimeter titanium tubular ice screw from my harness. I cleared the rotten surface snow with the adze of my axe, found a solid vein of blue glacial ice, and drove the screw deep into the wall until only the eyelet remained. I threaded my dynamic climbing rope through it, creating a flawless, secure belay point. "Step exactly where I step," I shouted back to her over the roaring wind, pointing at the fractured ice bridge. "Keep your weight centered directly over your front points. Do not lean into the wall." I crossed the gap, the ice groaning dangerously under my weight. I turned, dug my boots into a solid stance, and held the rope taut. Camille didn't hesitate. She stepped onto the fragile bridge, her face a mask of pure concentration. Halfway across, her left crampon slipped on a slick patch, sending a shower of ice shards into the dark void below. The rope went instantly tight in my hands, catching her weight with a heavy jolt. I locked the line against my hip, immovable. She drove the forged pick of her axe hard into the solid wall above her, hauled her center of gravity back up, and finished the crossing with mechanical precision. Her chest heaved with exertion, but she immediately unclipped and prepared to move. I unclipped the belay, and we kept moving upward. I finally reached the primary anchor point, a heavy, forged steel ring bolted deep into the solid rock face by the Park Service. I quickly clipped my nylon safety harness into the ring and pulled the heavy, laminated red closure tag from my inner pocket. Before I could secure the heavy brass padlock to the tag, the radio strapped to my chest crackled loudly, breaking through the wind. "Zaire!" Marcus's voice was frantic, bordering on panic. "Telemetry is spiking off the charts. The squall isn't building, it's collapsing directly onto your exact elevation. You have maybe 10 minutes before absolute zero visibility and a 50-degree temperature drop." I looked up the steep trail. The snow was blowing so hard it looked like solid television static. I secured the red tag to the steel ring with a heavy carabiner, legally closing the upper mountain. The contract was protected, the liability was shifted. I had won the bureaucratic fight. I turned around to check on Camille, expecting her to be standing right behind me to verify the tag. She wasn't there. She was standing 20 feet below me on the steep, exposed incline. She wasn't moving. She was leaning heavily on the shaft of her ice axe, her head bowed against the brutal wind. I unclipped from the primary anchor and moved quickly down the slick slope to her position. The ambient temperature had plummeted drastically in the last 5 minutes, the cold biting entirely through the thick Gore-Tex layers of my expedition gear. "Camille!" I shouted over the roar of the wind. "The pass is officially closed. The legal data is secured. We're turning back." She didn't answer. She slowly, agonizingly lifted her head. Her polarized goggles were completely frosted over with solid ice. She was shivering with violent, uncontrollable, full-body tremors. The aggressive, punishing pace I had set, combined with the sudden pressure drop, had completely drained her core thermal reserves. "Camille!" I barked, my voice cutting sharply through the storm. I recognized the immediate, lethal onset of rapid hypothermic shock. "Can you feel your boots?" I can't feel the ice," she stammered, the words slurring heavily together, her jaw locked tight. The heavy brass padlock slipped from my freezing fingers, hitting the granite with a sharp clatter before vanishing into the dark void below. I didn't look for it. I didn't look up at the summit. I unclipped my safety tether from the anchor and reached directly for the thick nylon strap of her chest harness. "We can't go down," I said, rapidly assessing the fully exposed trail behind us. "The wind chill on the descent will kill you. Your core temp is crashing." I looked wildly around the dark, jagged rocks of the ridge, my mind calculating the survival geometry. "There's an emergency municipal supply cache 50 yards east along the ledge. We're going there." I hooked the heavy steel carabiner directly to the forged D-ring on her chest harness and locked the gate shut. I became her primary physical anchor to the mountain. "Walk," I commanded, moving eastward along the narrow, treacherous ledge. I pulled her forward, deliberately positioning my larger frame to absorb the brunt of the horizontal wind, physically shielding her from the worst of the storm. Every single step was a brutal, exhausting negotiation with the slick ice. I didn't complain, and I didn't stop moving for a single second. I focused entirely on the tension of the tether connecting us. We reached the small, reinforced aluminum cache box, bolted securely to the leeward side of a massive granite boulder, just as the squall hit with absolute, blinding fury. The visibility dropped to exactly zero. The world disappeared into a deafening roar of white. I forced the frozen, iced-over latch open with the sharp adze of my axe, hauled the heavy metal lid back, and shoved her inside the small, cramped space. It was barely large enough for 2 people, designed strictly for temporary, desperate survival. I climbed in immediately after her, pulling the heavy lid shut against the wind and locking the internal latch. The sudden, immediate silence was stunning. The violent roar of the wind outside was reduced to a dull, muffled, continuous vibration against the thick, aluminum walls. The air inside the cache was freezing, but it was entirely stagnant, completely protected from the lethal wind chill. I immediately pulled a thick, foil-lined mylar thermal blanket from the emergency supplies strapped to the interior wall. Camille was curled into a tight, shivering ball in the far corner, her breathing shallow and dangerously erratic. I didn't offer soft, comforting words or empty apologies. I moved with absolute, pragmatic, mechanical efficiency. "Sit up," I instructed, my voice low and completely steady. She struggled to move. I reached over, gently pulling her upright against the metal wall. I wrapped the heavy mylar blanket tightly around her shoulders, meticulously sealing the edges under her legs to trap her escaping body heat. I pulled a heavy, military-grade chemical heat pack from my inner jacket pocket, snapped the internal disc to activate the exothermic reaction, and shoved it directly into the center pocket of her parka, right over her chest cavity. I sat down heavily next to her on the cold metal floor. The space was incredibly tight. Our shoulders and hips were pressed firmly together, our insulated layers crushing against each other. "You pushed too hard," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the pitch-black box. "I know," I admitted immediately. The truth was heavy and bitter in my mouth. I didn't make excuses. I treated this mountain like a balance sheet. I put the contract before the client. It won't ever happen again. I reached out in the dark and pulled her heavy, frozen outer gloves off. Her fingers were stiff, entirely pale, and freezing to the touch. I pulled off my own thick gloves. My own skin burned with the sudden exposure to the sub-zero air, but I ignored the sting, focusing entirely on wrapping my large, naturally warm hands completely around hers. I didn't rub them. Friction on freezing skin would permanently damage the delicate tissue. I just held them firmly, applying steady, consistent pressure, transferring my core body heat directly into her skin through contact. "Focus on your breathing," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level, anchoring her to the sound of my voice. "In through the nose, out through the mouth. Regulate the system. Let the heat pack work." For the next hour, we sat in the absolute, sensory-depriving dark of the metal box. I didn't let go of her hands. I monitored her pulse steadily through her wrist with my thumb. Then, a new hazard presented itself. The tight seal of the aluminum box was saving us from the wind, but our combined exhalations were rapidly saturating the tiny space with carbon dioxide. Camille's breathing hitched, growing slightly faster, a subtle sign of early hypoxia. I released her hands for exactly 3 seconds. I reached up to the heavy internal latch, gripped the freezing metal, and cracked the lid open exactly half an inch. The scream of the wind immediately rushed back in, accompanied by a razor-thin blade of sub-zero air that sliced across our faces. "What are you doing?" she gasped, recoiling from the sudden cold. "Venting the CO2 buildup," I explained, holding the heavy lid manually in place so the wind didn't rip it open entirely. "We can survive the cold with the blanket and the heat pack. We can't survive suffocating on our own exhaust." 10 seconds. I counted down in my head, balancing the lethal mathematics of hypoxia against hypothermia. At 0, I slammed the lid shut and locked it again, plunging us back into the silent dark. I immediately grabbed her hands again, resuming the heat transfer. "You don't miss a variable, do you?" she noted quietly, the violent shivering finally subsiding into manageable tremors. "I missed the most important one today," I said, the darkness allowing for absolute honesty. "I thought I could control the environment. If I own the permit, I own the rules. Risk can't be controlled," Camille replied, her voice gaining strength, the analyst returning. "It can only be mitigated. You stopped mitigating. You became the hazard." "I know," I said, acknowledging the sharp, undeniable truth of her words. "If you document this in your final insurance report," I noted dryly, breaking the heavy silence a few minutes later, "my premium is going to skyrocket." I felt her shift slightly beside me. A short, quiet puff of amusement escaped her in the dark. "If I tell my board of directors I spent 2 hours trapped in a tin can with an obsessive expedition guide, they'll mandate a full psychological evaluation. I'll pay the copay," I replied seamlessly, the micro-joy of her dry humor acting as a necessary pressure release valve in the cramped space. At 3 a.m., the vibration against the aluminum walls fundamentally changed. "The squall is passing," I noted quietly, listening to the changing frequency of the metal. "How do you know?" she asked, her voice entirely clear now, the dangerous slurring gone. "The acoustic baseline changed. The pressure is equalizing outside." I slowly, reluctantly released her warm hands, reaching down to pull my thick gloves back on. I pulled my GPS unit from my chest pocket. The fixed lines are still securely anchored on the GPS map. "We can make the descent to base camp safely in 90 minutes. "What about Vance?" she asked, the professional risk analyst returning to the forefront. "The municipal rangers are already prepping the high-altitude helicopter at the lower airstrip," I said, reaching up to unlock the heavy internal latch of the cache. "They'll retrieve his clients at dawn. His commercial permit is suspended, pending the ranger investigation at dawn." I pushed the heavy lid open. The storm had broken completely, revealing a stunning, razor-sharp canopy of brilliant stars above the jagged granite peaks. The air was violently cold, but completely, perfectly still. We climbed stiffly out of the cache. I took her heavy safety tether and secured it directly to the primary load-bearing loop on my harness, double-checking the locking mechanism with a sharp tug. "I'm setting the technical pace," I told her, looking directly into her eyes under the starlight. "But you dictate the physical speed. If you need to stop for 10 seconds, we stop. No arguments." She nodded, a small, genuine smile touching the corner of her mouth, recognizing the permanent shift in my operational priorities. "Understood, Captain." We started the descent. The terrain that had been brutal on the way up was now covered in a slick, deceptive layer of fresh rime ice. 20 minutes down the trail, we reached the primary descent anchor for the steepest couloir. It was completely buried under 2 feet of hardened snow and ice. I stopped, pulling my ice axe free. Anchor is buried. Stand clear. I spent 5 grueling minutes aggressively hacking away the frozen shell, my shoulders burning with the effort. When I finally cleared the steel ring, the carabiner gate was frozen shut. I pulled my brass hammer and cracked the ice off the mechanism with a single, precise strike. I threaded the rope. Camille immediately stepped up, entirely unprompted, and locked her belay device onto the line. She took the slack, perfectly managing the tension without a word of instruction while I checked the friction. We weren't just tethered anymore. We were operating as a synchronized unit. The descent to base camp took exactly an hour and a half. It was methodical, deliberate, and entirely safe. We arrived at the main command tent just as the eastern horizon began to turn a pale, bruised purple with the impending dawn. Marcus pushed the heavy canvas flap open as we approached. Thank God, telemetry went entirely dark an hour ago. The municipal rescue desk was on standby. "Stand them down," I said, unhooking the tether from my harness. "We're secure." Marcus handed us each a battered blue tin mug filled to the brim with steaming black coffee. The heat radiating through the cheap metal into my palms was the best thing I had ever felt. Camille walked into the warm tent, wrapping both hands around her blue tin mug. She didn't collapse into a chair or complain about her frozen muscles. She walked directly to the radio console, bypassed Marcus entirely, and picked up the heavy communication mic. "This is Camille Walker, lead underwriter for Apex Insurance," she said clearly into the receiver, transmitting on the open, universally monitored municipal frequency. Logging formal, on-site verification of extreme weather hazard at the Upper Ridge anchor point. Captain Zaire Young executed a flawless, legally necessary route closure and client stabilization protocol. His agency's safety metrics are absolutely verified and permanently cleared for the season. She hung up the mic with a sharp click. With one highly public, officially logged statement, she formally ended the investigation and permanently secured my business contract in front of every listening outfitter on the mountain. Vance's sabotage was dead. She turned to look at me, taking a slow sip from the battered blue mug. The physical exhaustion was evident in the heavy slope of her shoulders, but the professional threat that had haunted her for weeks was entirely gone. "The data is officially logged," she said simply. "The data is logged," I agreed, recognizing the absolute loyalty in the act. 3 days later, the frozen mountain was thousands of miles behind us. We were back at the coastal training facility in Southern California. The air coming through the open window was warm, smelling heavily of salt, surfboard wax, and blooming jasmine, a stark, brilliant contrast to the howling ice. I was sitting in my small, cluttered office. The laminated red closure tag from the ridge anchor sat squarely in the center of my wooden desk, a permanent reminder of the structural line I had almost crossed. I held a heavy metal brush in my hand, aggressively scraping the accumulated grit off my steel crampons over a trash can. I looked at the aggressive expansion spreadsheets taped to my wall, pulled them down, and dropped them into the recycling bin. The front door of the shop chimed. Boot steps echoed down the hallway. Marcus was talking to the receptionist just outside my door. The door to my office clicked open. Camille walked in. She wore a sharp, structured navy blazer, her dark hair pulled back perfectly. The shivering vulnerability of the ice was entirely gone, replaced by her usual, unyielding corporate competence. She held her cell phone on speaker in her left hand, making sure the audio carried into the hallway where my staff could hear. "Sarah," Camille said to the phone, her voice carrying absolute public authority, "finalize the comprehensive risk assessment initiative today. Book all logistical planning sessions directly at the coastal facility. And list Captain Zaire Young as the official co-chair for the committee. You clear every single operational schedule through him." "Copy that, Camille," her assistant replied clearly. "Sending the contracts now." Camille ended the call, formally and publicly establishing my status in her professional hierarchy. She walked directly to my desk. She didn't offer a polite, professional courtesy to say thank you for the heat pack. She placed a familiar, battered blue tin mug filled with steaming black coffee directly onto the edge of my desk, right next to the red closure tag. She had kept the mug from base camp. She dropped a thick, legal document, bound in a blue cover, onto the center of my calendar. "I run an active, full-time expedition agency," I said, my voice steady, looking from the tin mug to her face. "I'm rarely at sea level for more than a month." "I know exactly what your schedule is," she agreed, stepping a half-inch closer to the edge of the desk, not backing down an inch from my stare. "But the contract explicitly mandates that the primary consultant must be physically present for all major logistical planning sessions. In this specific office, with me, she was explicitly choosing to anchor me, not because she needed a rescue, but because she actively, fiercely, wanted the proximity. The cold, ambitious void I had carefully maintained for years suddenly felt entirely unnecessary. "I expect the consultancy invoice paid in full on the first of every month," I stated, setting the blunt, practical terms of the arrangement. "Agreed," she replied without a single second of hesitation. I reached out and picked up the heavy steel pen lying on my desk. I didn't hesitate. I signed my name aggressively on the solid black line at the bottom of the final page. I pushed the contract back across the desk. She picked it up, her bare fingers briefly, deliberately brushing against the back of my knuckles. The physical contact was brief, completely professional for the setting, but it carried the absolute weight of a heavy steel door, finally locking securely into place. "The safety committee meets on Monday morning at 9, she said, a small, genuine smile completely lighting up her dark eyes. "I'll be there," I replied. The end. Closing thoughts. He didn't promise her a dramatic rescue or a perfect life. The red closure tag stayed on his desk. The battered blue tin mug became a permanent morning ritual, and he simply showed up the next day. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.